Hello, countercultural friends. This is Stephen Coates, beaming out to you from the Bureau of Lost Culture, somewhere in London, somewhen in 2023. Now, on this programme, we've had conversations with artists, writers, musicians, journalists, and just some very interesting human beings. But we haven't heard from a philosopher. And I think that is because I'm perhaps a little bit intimidated by philosophy. I felt that, it's not for me. It's perhaps beyond me. Maybe a bit boring, a bit bourgeois. Perhaps you feel the same. But maybe that's about to change, because recently I was at an event called Philosophy Slam, and it got me thinking, because it was actually great fun as well as thought-provoking. And I got to thinking that maybe philosophy in some ways, at least, could be very countercultural indeed. So I've invited a philosopher to come to the Bureau. Robert Rowland Smith is a polymath, the author of 7 books, including the bestseller Breakfast with Socrates and The Reality Test. He's been a columnist for the Sunday Times, regularly speaks on radio and TV, and he practices something called Constellations. It's a kind of group therapy which we're going to hear about. He's also rather handsome, not the image of a philosopher I had in mind, which was, I guess, somebody who looks a bit like Charles Darwin, that kind of Victorian, middle-aged white man beard thing. Well, we're going to talk about philosophy, we're going to talk about counterculture. We're also going to get into Jacques Derrida, David Lynch, R D Laing, the living and the dead, philosophy as a psychedelic, expansion of consciousness and expansion of unconsciousness, and all sorts of other things. Welcome, Robert, to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you again. So last time I saw you, as I just mentioned, was at Philosophy Slam with your, let's call him your partner in mind, Mark Vernon. And for anybody listening, a question for me has been, can philosophy be fun? And actually, your Philosophy Slam, I would describe it as rather good fun, as well as illuminating and a bit consciousness expanding. But just tell us what it is, Philosophy Slam,
Yeah, I was thinking it's probably sit-down comedy, really. Well, basically what happens is we arrive in a room, Mark and I. So Mark Vernon, as you say, is my partner in mind, partner in crime. And we stand up in front of a crowd, and an audience throws out a single word, and then we'll try and riff on whatever the word is. So I think last time you came, somebody threw out the word denim, another person threw out the word croissant, and we just try and say something reasonably cogent about those things, sort of rapidly sweeping together fragments of knowledge from history of philosophy or ideas or psychology or whatever.
Or what you've read in the news today.
Or what we've read in the news today, yeah. And I think that's part of the point. It's sort of, because philosophy is considered so inaccessible and highbrow, I mean, we didn't begin with a campaign to make it accessible and lowbrow,
right.
But we sort of thought, well, there's no reason why this stuff can't be enjoyable and fun and applicable to, everyday life.
Well, I've got a list of questions for you, and I don't want to jump ahead just yet, but one of them later is that can philosophy be for everybody, actually? And I think I'd like to come back to that, right?
Sure.
But just to reverse even a bit further about you, you've got an extremely impressive CV.
Pause.
But I thought I'd start off with a philosophical question,
okay.
Right? Which is, who is Robert Rowland Smith?
It's funny you say that. I've just been devising a course, actually, for people called Who Are You? And what became apparent very early on is it's extremely hard to separate the who from the what. So if I ask you the same question, who's Stephen Coates? You might say, I'm a man, or, I identify as a man, at least you probably have to say these days. And I could say similar things. I'm a man, I'm 58, I'm a philosopher, I'm a writer, I'm a father. But they're kind of more questions that answer the question, what are you, rather than who are you? So it becomes quite difficult to answer the question, who are you? And I think there are 2 ways into that. The quick way into that is to say, what are the adjectives that apply to you? So, what's Stephen like? He's charming, he's clever, he's curious.
Oh, shucks.
And that gives me more of a sense of who you are rather than what you are. But then I was also thinking, actually, you can learn something more from psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in answering that question. And the answer to it is, I am whatever I make you feel.
Give me a moment on that one.
Yeah.
You are whatever you make me feel.
Yeah,
Okay, right.
exactly. So if I make you feel relaxed,
Mm-hmm.
then, I'm a kind of relaxing, comfortable, nice person to be around. If I make you feel scared or intimidated, then I'm a slightly intimidating, slightly scary person. And I think that's a more reliable reading, really, or barometer of the question. Because after all, we are who we are in relation to other people all the time.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
One thing I thought on my way here, sitting on the bus, was that we tend to think that we've got the kind of monopoly on who we are. I was listening to somebody talking about their father who was dead.
Yeah.
And my own experiences because my father's dead, but an experience of actually still being connected to him. My father, just Stephen's father, probably felt he had a monopoly on who he was, but in fact, you could see it that he actually existed in all the minds of the people who knew him as well. And that the bigger Stephen's father was this kind of creature who had a field around him of people who knew him. So his consciousness spread out. And of course, in that sense, he's still alive.
Yeah. And I think I've invited you along, maybe we'll talk about it today, to this thing called Constellations in a couple of weeks, which is exactly about that.
Right.
And one of the things there that's so pertinent to this is that there's no real boundary between the living and the dead, partly because the dead still annex our mind in some ways, partly because they're invited in by us because we want them to, but partly because some of the dead have unfinished business here, so they are trying to annex the minds of others. So I think it kind of can reverse both ways. And that, of course, raises the question of, do we know what's going on in the back of our mind anyway? We can talk about the unconscious, we can talk about dreams and so on. I mean, I was in psychoanalysis for a while, just round the corner from here, actually, on Mead Street for several years. And I think probably the process of self-knowledge is probably kind of infinite in a way. You can keep unpeeling layers. Not that we're all so fascinating and complicated, it's just that the barriers to self-knowledge are pretty high because we don't want to know certain things about ourselves. We like to think we're coherent selves. It's an odd idea that we're not. The monopoly owner of our own psyche.
So I've got my second question for you, which is, who is Robert Rowland Smith?
Right, okay, thanks for that. Well, there's one thing my analyst used to say to me, actually, is exactly that. She said, one thing I experience about you, Robert, is that when I serve the ball to you, you knock it back intelligently, politely, and so on, but you never really answer the bloody question.
Right, well, I'll let you off. Let's come back to that one. Maybe I'll finish off with that one. But we've dived in quite deep already. But I thought we could get onto the subject of philosophy as counterculture. This Brew of Lost Culture is a show which is largely about countercultural themes, right? Yeah. And is philosophy actually counterculture of the mind? Because I don't know that much about philosophy, and I'm here as an inquirer. But it seemed to me that my image of it is that it's been around for thousands of years, and it's always been slightly questioning the culture, right, which is one aspect of what we call counterculture. So I thought maybe you could talk about that a bit. Is philosophy a kind of countercultural thinking? And then we could focus in on the counterculture, which is by which we sort of talk about the 50s and 60s in particular, where everything came up for question.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I mean, if you think of the origins of philosophy, well, what we think of the origins of philosophy, particularly in the figure of Socrates, and he was nothing if not countercultural. I mean, he was a massive pain in the arse to the state in particular, and he was effectively assassinated by proxy by the state. And why? Because he went around asking questions, interrogating everything, taking nothing for granted, probing into, the order of society, why people live the lives they do, why we call certain things good and other things bad. So in that sense, I think philosophy, certainly in that tradition, begins as a gesture of refusal or something countercultural. That, in its sort of most classic high point in the doctrine of skepticism with people like Descartes, is also the origin of science, actually, interestingly, because it's a way of saying, no, we don't accept religion, for example. We need to measure everything, look at everything, get some data on everything, and then we'll tell you if we believe this or that. So it's strange to think of science as counterculture, because we think generally these days science is the culture, the dominant culture, actually. Maybe less so in the States than here, perhaps. So there's been that strain throughout philosophy of, embracing the question rather than accepting the dogma or the doctrine. But I think it's also worth saying there are exceptions to that as well. You know, philosophy is, particularly these days, associated with orthodox, rational, conscious thought. It's associated with universities and clever people and with logic, you know, so anything but counterculture.
So the establishment, actually.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And you know, if you ask what's the establishment about, other than being about sort of a political class, it would be the establishment of reason, the establishment of government, the establishment of law. And the whole other side of philosophy is about the building of those edifices, or the logical building of those edifices.
Yeah, so maybe it's time now to return to that question I said earlier, which is that is philosophy for everybody? I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but I think that vision of philosophers, the sort of establishment, the kind of the Oxford dons, well, the stuffy academic world, I think a lot of us think about it in that way, but you're not really present it like that yourself. And so do you think philosophy is potentially for everybody? And can it make us all happier?
It's interesting because, you know, I was an Oxford don for 13 years, and that within Oxford there was a division actually already there between the orthodox, classic, slightly old school, logical philosopher, what's called Anglo-Saxon philosophy, on the one hand, which is not really for everybody because it's very technical. There are highly abstruse papers written on very narrow subjects. So that's one tradition and still very strongly upheld. But the other tradition, which was the one I was much more interested in, which is called continental philosophy, European philosophy, is all about how to live life, basically.
Right.
And that, for sure, is for everybody. It's like, what is life? How do we examine our existence? You know, what's a good life? You know, what is the nature of love? What happens to us when we die? It seems to me those are, for sure, those are questions for everybody, because whether we talk about ourselves as philosophers or not, occasionally we'll wonder about those things, right? You know, how can I live the best life? What do I value? What's the best way to treat other people? So these very much belong in that other tradition, really, of philosophy, which is, yeah, definitely for everybody. It's for everybody because I'd be amazed, you know, we're recording this in the middle of Soho. I'd be amazed if we went out on the street and did a vox pop and asked people, you know, what do you think about, you know, what do you think is important in life? That we wouldn't get answers to those questions. Right. And we'd get answers because people think about them.
Right.
Know, and they'd say things like, yeah, I think what's important in life is being happy or having relationships or having a legacy.
Or they might say dancing.
Yeah.
Or music.
Yeah.
You know, or clothes. Could be all sorts of stuff,
yeah, exactly.
Depending on how old you are and things.
Everybody is a philosopher at the moment you just start thinking, really.
You describe it as broadly two strands, right? So there is the kind of, let's call it the slightly older establishment, slightly more stuffy, refined for a small group of people, right? Quite technical.
Basically. And
then there's the kind of the much wider tradition of addressing what we might call philosophical questions, which is like, how do we live? And how, you know, what can we do with all this stuff around us, and what do we make of it all? So there's like two strands, the philosophy of the school and the philosophy of the street, as it were.
Yeah, and within that second tradition, there are, you know, key philosophers like Montaigne, French philosopher who wrote all about how to live. Mm-hmm. And that's extremely accessible stuff. I mean, it's, you know, it's written in 17th century French, so you have to read a modern English translation for sure, but it's very accessible. But you also, within that tradition, also get people like Heidegger or Nietzsche writing about what it means to be human in a way that is a bit more technical, for sure. But the questions are universal and human and kind of vital in a way.
Let's stick with that second tradition, street philosophy, let's call it, whatever. Do you think that actually has the potential to make us happier?
Now, that's a difficult one. I mean, when I was growing up, my mum always used to say to me, you know, Robert, you need to think less. It's like, you know...
That didn't work out.
That didn't work out very well. Ignorance is bliss, Robert, you know.
Right.
And I was thinking about that on the way here today, which is, you probably heard this phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living. It's a famous phrase attributed to Socrates. And it's true, when you think as well as live, you kind of live twice. You know, you get your life and the reflection on it. Whether it makes you happier or not, I don't know. It's not my personal experience that makes me happier. It brings me understanding. It brings me insight. It brings me knowledge. It brings me ways of framing things. Would I be happier being less philosophical? Yeah, I might well be.
A friend of mine, very good friend of mine, Glenn Duncan, who's a writer, we always used to divide the world into... Well, first of all, we used to divide the world into people who divide the world into things and people who don't. But we used to divide the world into sort of what we call seekers and expanders. We considered both of us to be seekers, as in asking questions about stuff all the time, right the way back to being sort of 13, 14. And expanders, people who just enjoy life. I was slightly envious. Is it Narcissus and Goldman, the Hermann Hesse book? Narcissus is a seeker and Goldman's he's out there fucking and fighting. And the book is about, in a way, who's happier, actually, at the end of the day. But we came to the conclusion that you're kind of stuck. If that's the hand you've been dealt, can't get out of it.
I mean, it's torture being told that, actually, Stephen, to be honest, because now I feel like an expander trapped in a seeker's body. It's like, oh my God, you've actually named the tragedy of my existence. Very deftly there.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it'd be better to be an expander, wouldn't it?
Obviously, we came up with that description a long time ago, and it's not quite as clear cut, and as times change, one changes a bit as well, All right, well, let's talk about Jacques Derrida. You knew him personally. I thought, well, I better get up to speed a little bit on Derrida because of our conversation. And I had an interesting experience, which was both like seeking and expanding, because I read a bit about him and I reached the limit of my ability to understand quite quickly, actually. However, the experience itself was quite enjoyable.
There must be an analogy in there.
So there's something in that somehow, is that we don't necessarily have to understand it
to enjoy it. Sounds like sex to me. But yeah, and we should say, actually, R.I.P. Jacques Derrida's son, who died just very recently, last couple of weeks, Pierre Alféry, who is a great thinker and poet in his own right. But yeah, Derrida does suffer from this reputation of being, difficult and obscure and all the rest of it. And some of his work is, and some of his work isn't. I mean, he published, I haven't counted actually, but it must be at least 50 books, I would have thought, and numerous articles. And when you said you wanted to talk about Derrida, I thought the standard accounts, it seems to me, are all way off beam, like they associate Derrida with things he didn't want to be associated with. For example, this word deconstruction. I was looking at this, there's a construction company in Soho called Deconstruction. I was looking at it on the way here and thought, yeah, it's such a shame that he's associated with that word, because it sounds so negative and like he's just tearing down the edifice of thought. So I thought what I might try and do is give actually one specific example of an argument by Derrida that I think can be applied more broadly, but sort of takes you into a wormhole. One of Derrida's big arguments is that the nature of writing gives us a huge clue into the nature of being. Okay? So he gives the example of quotation. Say I say the word music, or I write down the word music. You understand the word music, I understand the word music, and that's great. But if I say the word music, it doesn't stop you from going on to say the word music after me. You can quote me. You can then use the word after I've used it, because the word hasn't been used up when I've said it. It's not like words have a one-time only use value. We can keep saying the word music just as we can keep saying the word microphone or laptop or AirPods or whatever. He says, that's very interesting. If something can be repeated, what does that say about the nature of the word? And this is where he starts making his big leap, basically. He says, if it can be repeated, then it was never entirely there in the first place. It's already ready to go and belong in another context somewhere else.
With a slightly different meaning. So he comes up with this conclusion that anything that we think is fully there, like the word music when I say it, harbours this part of itself which is not fully there, and has to be not fully there so it can be repeated, quoted, changed, iterated in future contexts. And he goes on from that to actually say, well, that's kind of like the nature of being as a whole. Like you're sitting there opposite me, Stephen, I'm sitting here opposite you. We are here, but insofar as we have life, we're going to be somewhere else next. You've got plans this afternoon, I've got plans this afternoon. So we're never fully here, ever, because we're going to need to be somewhere else later
And in order to be able to move in time somewhere else, we have to be not fully here. There's this huge thing these days about mindfulness. You probably, lots of people meditate, and how do you be present to the other person? I mean, you interview a lot. You have to be present to the interviewee, although, of course, you'll have other things going on in your head. So we value the notion of presence enormously and think how great to be present and not be distracted by Instagram or whatever. But what Derrida's saying is actually something more fundamental about that. We can never really be entirely present. And he says the whole of Western philosophy ultimately comes down to this view that there is such a thing as presence, or what we might call being, but actually when you interrogate it, it's built on absence, really, or the potential for absence. For me, that's quite a nice way into talking about Derrida.
As you're speaking, so again, I'm feeling the limits of my understanding, right? The process of actually trying to understand it is actually quite enjoyable, right? Just to bring it back to a kind of sensory thing in a way. But also that brings me on to something else that I wanted to talk about with Derrida and the 60s. It reminds me a bit of my psychedelic experiences. Yeah. My own personal psychedelic experiences have been mind-bending, but actually they've done the same thing as you were talking about then. They've kind of questioned the sort of fundamental ideas that things are separate, that they're not related to other things. They don't have these echoes. So I was wondering whether, in a way, you could describe him as the sort of psychedelic philosopher.
Well, yes.
And also specifically because he seemed to kind of emerge in the 60s. He's from a sort of lower middle class background, right? Not from a kind of like aristocratic background, right? Yeah. So he came from the underground in a way, or from underneath. What he was saying at the time, it did reflects some of the concerns of the countercultural years, didn't it? And he was a disruptor. Let's avoid deconstruction, but and he annoyed a lot of the establishment. And there was something about him, wasn't there not, that was, in a way, quite countercultural.
Yeah, totally. And not just him. I mean, he and a group of other people, French intellectuals, quote unquote, that he's associated with, particularly leading up to 1968 and the riots and the student movement and all of that. There was a whole group called Tel Quel, which were sort of not just Marxist intellectuals, but kind of Maoist intellectuals, actually, whether or not you agree with that, who are all really going back to fundamentals. That got manifested kind of on the streets in terms of kind of student activity, resistance to authority, feminism, questioning the authority of particularly in France. I mean, Paris, so orthodox, and the academy.
De Gaulle and all that.
Yeah, exactly. An extraordinary ferment really going on there intellectually as well as politically. The legacy of Sartre is still there as well, still felt. That really was a countercultural movement, but one that spilled out onto the street. Right. So there really was a link between, high deconstruction, as it were, and
social activism.
And real social activism.
The other thing which happened in the 60s, mainly because of LSD, but also because of new ways of thinking, new ways of believing, new ways of acting, new ways of living, actually. Lots of things are being overturned, the previous generation's certainties and absolute ideas about things. Consciousness itself was kind of loosening up in that period. That's one of the things I'm kind of fascinated by. In a way, that's been one of the roles of philosophy, to loosen up and explore consciousness, right? Yeah. So there is a sort of parallel there, and I'm just intrigued by the notion that they didn't really seem to cross over. I mean, what would it have been like if Derrida had done acid?
I don't know that he didn't. I mean, he was, maybe it was part of it. I'm sure there is material around that. It's interesting you talk about the expanding of consciousness. I'd want to also flip that on its head a bit and say the expanding of unconsciousness is just as important. Because it strikes me, particularly in creative practice, and again, you know a lot more about this than I do, that people become more creative, not when they expand their consciousness, as in their awareness of what's going on around them, but rather when they have the courage to tarry with what's in their unconscious and bring out all of those things which in normal life might be considered shameful or taboo or edgy or disruptive or difficult. So if you think about I was thinking about the paintings of Francis Bacon, for example, it looks like it's been served up from this stagnant pond of his unconscious. I mean, it's disgusting, most of it. But it's so striking and so vivid and so groundbreaking because of that, I think, because he wasn't censoring material that, as it was brought out. And for me, yes, expansion of consciousness for sure, But just as important is probably this idea of expansion of the unconscious, or at least the tolerating of what's in the unconscious.
I love that. For philosophy, for philosophers, what do they make of the unconscious?
Well, philosophy and philosophers don't really talk about the unconscious
Right.
Very much at all, partly because one of the big distinctions in philosophy is between philosophy and psychology, and most philosophers think psychology is nonsense, and most psychologists don't read philosophy. Of course, I'm exaggerating, and there are overlaps. But if you think about Freudian psychology or psychoanalysis, very, very, very few philosophers would take that seriously. And one of the reasons I love Derrida's work is that he did, and he tried to integrate Freudian psychoanalysis with philosophy and other things. But there is that distinction between the two, because one is considered weird, how do you prove the unconscious, and the other is considered sort of logical.
This is a sidebar, not about philosophy, but about the Bureau of Lost Culture. Regular listeners will now probably be weary of me pushing our bulletin and mailing list at the beginning of the show, so I thought I'd surprise them by sneaking it into the middle this time. And the reason is that we're coming up to our 100th episode. Can you believe it? I also received notification recently that our listenership is over 100,000, which is both mind-boggling and very pleasing. So thanks for listening. Keep listening. Tell your friends, their family, neighbours, boss, kids. The Bureau of Lost Culture is dedicated to exploring countercultural themes, oral histories, testimonies, strange half-remembered, half-forgotten, buried stories. And as well as these broadcasts, we have various projects, live events and ongoing research. If you haven't already signed up, do sign up for our bulletins, because we want to find out more about you. So we're about to send out a little questionnaire. It'll be great to hear who you are, where you are, what you like and what you like more of. I decided a long time ago that I'm happiest when contributing to the culture through music, words and stories. If you can support us in that, then terrific. Now, back to the show. What are philosophers doing today, apart from studying the philosophers of the past? What are you up to? What are you?
Good question. Well, we meet in secret rooms and we shake each other's hands in very unusual ways.
Countercultural.
Yeah. What is happening today is that the university as a whole is becoming democratized, in the sense that knowledge is becoming democratized. You can look anything up on the internet, is what I mean by that. So there's, the walls around learning have come right down because everything's on Google or what have you. So that's the first thing that's happening. Second thing, you have a huge hunger for ideas now in the culture, which I think is new and has been enabled by technology, by TED Talks and so on. You've had lots of people setting up things like the How To Academy or School of Life or salons. I mean, there's loads of them now, which serve the need for, people to hear about ideas. So philosophy is being dragged into that world. Also, I'm not in the academic world anymore, but, if I was an academic philosopher and I was doing this podcast with you, it'd be like, great, there's something I can put on my CV. It like shows I'm doing philosophy in the real world. Like, how cool to come to a studio in Soho. So philosophers are slightly edging out into the real world, but still 99% of philosophers are still paid by universities. You mentioned Mark Vernon earlier. He basically gets paid through his psychotherapy practice. I get paid by doing a whole variety of different things. So there are very, very, very few people like Mark and me who are sort of independent, whatever you'd call it, philosophers, thinkers. But at the same time, I think now, much more than ever before, you've got everyday people reading books about ideas. There is demand out there and there is supply. I mean, I think the supply is a bit tricky because a lot of philosophers are used to talking in quite technical language. So there's still a bit of a mismatch there. But generally speaking, that middle ground is growing. I think.
Yeah, it's good to hear that, because at the same time, of course, we're living in an increasingly superficial, materialistic world, right? So, yeah. I mean, and that's one of the things that I'm always asking myself and guests about, is that, where is the counterculture now? Because it seems to me that, in those classic years, the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, the whole thing was up for grabs in some way, and I'm thinking, where's that going on now? It is going on. Of course it's going on. It's going on in a different way, and there's always an underground, It seems to me more important than ever that there's countercultural thinking, because there's a lot of pressure around all of us, right? There's a lot of temptations to superficiality. I experience it myself every day. So, and materiality. So the great thing in some ways about this stuff is that, compared with psychedelics, is that it's free.
Yeah.
Largely.
Yeah.
It's legal.
Yeah.
Not that I'm doing away with psychedelics, by the way, but I'm just saying as a kind of an alternative way of expanding the unconscious on the conscious. It seems to me to be very necessary, right?
Actually, it's interesting you talk about psychedelics. You probably know this, but all of the important research now on depression and anxiety medication is all to do with psilocybin and things like that, right? And the main problems there are not the scientific evidence, it's the legal structures around it.
Sure.
Because the results, as I understand it, are extraordinary. So I think that counterculture or otherwise, that's the new frontier, right?
Then maybe there is an opportunity at some point where philosophy and psychedelics can kind of meet, and that some extraordinary new being's going to emerge from that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the other thing actually is not, the word I would use is intuition rather than consciousness or unconsciousness. Okay. Because I think that's the big area. How do we help people to trust their intuition, and for people to learn that that's as skillful a guide to knowledge as the accumulation of philosophy books or whatever. Each of us has intuition, and it's highly accurate, but it's buried for most of us for various reasons.
What are the things that bury it?
Because we're supposed to be so coherent, we're supposed to reason things out, we're supposed to weigh things up, analyze things. We're supposed to go with what our peers tell us to go with, or what Instagram tells us to go with. There are so many things drawing us away from this, but I think we all almost like this sort of fine index or compass or needle inside us. That for me is the thing, maybe it's part of expanding consciousness actually, that we need to bring out in people. That's why I'm so interested in constellations and systemic work.
Talk about that in a sec, actually. But I just wanted to close that loop for me with Derrida and what he did.
Yeah.
He disrupted things. He shook things up. He shook up the notion that there is the truth, right? There's this centre where we can kind of, the philosophy can identify eventually. Yeah. Has that led to where we are now, where everybody's truth is valid, and people talk about my truth.
I see.
Did he do something which maybe has had some rather unfortunate consequences?
Like you, I absolutely wince or cringe or whatever when I hear the phrase "speak my truth," because often what we're hearing there is, I'm projecting this thing about myself regardless of the facts, and I've got very little tolerance for that. It's a very good question, because I don't think Derrida single-handedly led the revolution towards, complete relativism where there's no truth, so whatever you claim to be true is true. What he was doing more, I think, was just saying the values of truth and reason belong to a master discourse of the West. You have to remember he wasn't a Westerner, he was
Algerian, right, yeah.
He also said it belongs to a master discourse of the male. He made up this fancy phrase, phallogocentrism, which means basically all of Western structures are based on reason and the phallus, basically. And they're all, basically European in their origin. And his was a critique of that. It wasn't saying, and therefore whatever you want to be true is true. In fact, he kind of went in the opposite direction. One of the reasons people find his work tricky to read is because it's so bloody rigorous. Most of his work is a reading of other philosophers, line by line, footnote by footnote. This is why you shouldn't trust what Plato says. This is why you shouldn't trust what, Descartes says. Because on line 42 of page 48, yes, there's no truth. The conclusion for that is not, therefore any truth is acceptable. It's therefore, read much more closely the claims that are being made and dig beneath them for the kind of power plays that are implicit in them.
Okay, so don't take things for granted.
Exactly.
Right. One of the previous guests we had on the show was the neuropsychiatrist Anthony David, and we talked about the countercultural anti-psychiatrist figure R D Laing. And one of Laing's themes was that, maybe like truth for Derrida, madness is relative. To an extent, sort of socially constructed, and insanity might even be like an understandable response to an insane world. He was writing at the time when the Vietnam War was raging, and it seemed like the threat of nuclear weapons could completely eradicate humanity. His anti-psychiatry theme, as it were, was that there isn't this thing called madness separate from sanity. You know, there isn't these oppositions, if you like. He was talking about mental health, actually, working with people who were in various degrees of intense distress. But he was trying to do somewhat of the same thing, though, maybe by trying to loosen up those definitions of what madness and sanity are.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because there was a famous spat between Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault after Foucault published one of his most famous works, which is called The History of Madness. You know, he talks about, the incarceration of mad people. Is madness a crime or is it a disease? And the ostracization of the mad, and the terrible show. People used to be able to go along and actually visit mad people. Anyway, so Foucault produces this book, The History of Madness, and Derrida, who was a pupil of Foucault, so there's a bit of master-pupil revenge here, or whatever, or certainly dialogue going on, says you can't write a history of madness, in principle. Why? Because madness is that which resists any attempt to describe it by definition. So a rational account of madness, it's a futile project. Of course, Foucault absolutely hates this, but he's got a point, and it's not dissimilar from what you're saying. Like, as soon as you describe madness in the language of science or reason or philosophy or logic, you've lost the very thing you've tried to capture. I mean, how you do describe, I don't know, maybe theatre is the way to do it. I mean, I've had the experience in Constellations, coming back to that. I remember this because it was so intense. I had to represent somebody, whose brother had committed a murder and had been put in a psychiatric hospital, and it was terrifying, because the inner violence going on in that person's psyche was so horrendous, really, and beyond description, really.
It's interesting you say about a history of madness, because, it's a history of humanity, isn't it? I mean, madness is what the culture defines as madness. It's
exactly.
been all sorts of things down the years, isn't it? From just having sex in Ireland, there's a sort of single woman, obviously mad, so lock you up. The thing which I really loved about Laing's, he said many wonderful poetic things. One of the things he said about schizophrenia, which I thought was really interesting, was that he said it's just a mistake with regard to metaphor.
Ah, how brilliant.
A metaphor is our way of kind of translating the world in some way and describing it. This around us in Soho, in this building and all this sort of stuff, is that, it's a one way of seeing reality, which we all agree on, most of us. There's a couple of people who don't agree on it. They've got different metaphors, or they've got a mistake with regard to the metaphor we're using. Yeah. And I thought that was a very compassionate way to describe it, rather than just seeing it in terms of either a horrendous chemical imbalance or the consequence of some childhood trauma.
Yeah, that's wonderful, that is. It also makes me think that, in a way, apart from anything else, as you were hinting at, really, to be mad is just not to belong. So whoever decides the rules on who belongs or who doesn't is creating the definition of madness. It's about belonging, not belonging. Segregation, actually, is the heart of it. And I also thought a while ago that actually all it takes for a mad person to be considered sane is for somebody else to speak the same language with them. Because then you have, like you're saying, you have agreement about something. Like the people in Soho, we all broadly agree on what's reality. This may or may not be a table in front of us, but as long as you and I agree it's a table, then it's a functional reality, if not a philosophical one. And madness may be sort of similar.
He tried to act that and live that out by actually, say at Kingsley Hall, a situation is sort of become a community where he and the sort of the staff, or whatever you want to call them, lived on equal terms with the patients in, the mad people, with some success. We know that, like, people who are in very difficult psychotic states need to be protected from themselves, and we need to be protected from them at times. It's not as simple as just talking about metaphors. There is a practical aspect of it. But he did try and live it out with some success, to actually listen to people and to talk to them in their own terms. Role play, if you like, but actually to try and get inside their metaphors, right?
Yeah.
So listen, let's talk about Constellations. So you invited me very kindly to one of your evenings coming up, which I'm looking forward to, with some trepidation, because I don't actually know what Constellations is. So.
But you're coming anyway.
Tell us about it and why what it is and why you do it, and how it's connected with what we've been talking about.
Okay, so I mean, if you like countercultural experiences, this is a way of having a psychedelic experience beyond philosophy that doesn't involve taking any drugs. So what you will experience is you'll come to a room, I do a regular thing in Bloomsbury, you'll sit in a circle, there'll be about 15 people. I'll say, so who'd like to go first? That person will come and sit next to me, and they'll explain very briefly an issue in their life. It could be, I miss my dad still, he's dead, but I still miss him. Or it could be, I can't get pregnant, or I'm losing money fast, or my boss hates me. It could be absolutely anything. To cut to the chase, what then happens is that the other people in the group, who are all strangers or semi-strangers, will then be chosen as representatives for different facets of this person's issue. So you, Stephen, who hasn't met this person before, might be asked to be that person's boss. Somebody else might be asked to be their mum. Somebody else to be their friend. Somebody else to be their money. Those 4 people stand up. You will find, and you'll have this experience when you come, you will find that the second you stand up and represent this person, or this person's dad or brother or whatever, you will become active with the person you're representing. No, it's not role play. I mean, people use different words for it. Channeling, embodying, manifesting, whatever, of that which you are representing. And what we can then do is get a pure reading of the inner system of the person who's brought their problem or issue, free from their own projections and stories and accounts and narratives and defenses about it. And then you get essentially a living tableau of that inner dynamic, a diagnosis that says, well, actually, you say your boss hates you, but what I see in the constellation, they're turning away, they're just very distracted by something else. To you, it looks like they hate you. In fact, it's they've got problems of their own, for example. So that's phase 1 diagnosis. Phase 2, we then, or I, in my role as, constellator, move things around in order to produce a new constellation or configuration that's going to be facilitative of that person's growth, health, movement in the real world, basically. So that's it in a nutshell. But it works on this principle of, you mentioned the word field earlier, unconscious field connections between us all.
I love the sound of it. I'm still remain slightly
sceptical.
Anxious. No, I'm not sceptical. I'm in, but I'm just anxious about it. It seems to be addressing things which are somewhat mysterious, right?
Yeah, totally.
Somewhat beyond our own kind of idea that we have the monopoly on it and who we are.
Well, exactly. Well, when you were talking about your dad, I mean, I was immediately seeing that in Constellations terms. I could see, you would say, I need to find some way of dealing with my grief. Okay, well, we'll have a representative for you, Stephen, and one for your dad, and we can see what's going on there. And there are other things we can do in that constellation to enable you to come to terms with it. You get your representative to say very simple sentences to the father representative.
Right.
And they could be as simple as, I still miss you.
Right.
And we could have your dad saying, I still miss you too, but now I'm here. So it can be a very beautiful process actually as well.
It sounds quite 1960s, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
It's a strange way, but I don't know when did it emerge, Constellations, as a thing?
Yeah, sort of in the 60s, post-war. Right. I mean, it has its roots in very ancient Zulu ritual, actually, to do with ancestor worship. The idea being that basically all of knowledge is always present. There's a Zulu word for it, which I'll get wrong, so I won't cite it here, which also connects actually with Western philosophical tradition, particularly in Plato. For Plato, all knowledge is remembering. So basically we go around the world forgetting everything in order to live. So to know anything, we have to unforget. And he has a word for that, anamnesis. Unforgetting is the way that we can access everything that we need to know. I listened to a beautiful thing with David Lynch the other day. He gave this incredible speech. I think it was an honorary doctorate, but about exactly that, how the field is accessible to us all. I mean, he accesses it, I think, mainly through meditation and other things.
He's a big practitioner of transcendental meditation, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. He has a beautiful, beautiful explanation of really what's going on in that process.
And also seems to be somebody who's connected with the unconscious
strongly.
In terms of his work, right?
Strongly. I mean, that the uncanny feeling you get, the feeling that this isn't coming from the top of the head or the left brain, and this is coming from somewhere else.
If you have a golf ball-sized consciousness, when you read a book, you'll have a golf ball-sized understanding. When you look out, a golf ball-sized awareness. And when you wake up in the morning, a golf ball-sized wakefulness. But if you could expand that consciousness, then you read the book, more understanding. You look out, more awareness. And when you wake up, more wakefulness. It's consciousness. And there's an ocean of pure, vibrant consciousness inside each one of us. And it's right at the source and base of mind, right at the source of thought, and it's also at the source of all matter. And Maharishi Mahesh Yogi teaches a technique called transcendental meditation. It's a simple, easy, effortless technique, yet supremely profound, that allows any human being to dive within, experiencing subtler levels of mind and intellect, and transcend and experience this ocean of pure consciousness. This pure consciousness is called by modern physics the unified field. It's at the base of all mind and all matter. And they now say, modern science says, all of matter, everything that is a thing, emerges from this field. And this field has qualities like bliss, intelligence, creativity, universal love, energy, peace. And it's not the intellectual understanding of this field, but the experiencing of it that does everything. You dive within and transcending, experiencing this field of pure consciousness, and you enliven it, you unfold it, it grows. It's money in the bank to get that beautiful consciousness growing, which is flowing creativity, the ability to catch ideas at a deeper level. Intuition grows. This field is a field of pure knowingness. You dive in there, you sort of just know how to go. You know how to solve solutions. It's like an ocean of solutions. And you can just feel this thing growing. But the ultimate thing for me is the enjoyment of the doing, the enjoyment of life grows huge. I love making films now more than ever before. Ideas flow more. Everybody has more fun on the set. Creativity flows. People look like friends and not like enemies. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, and it's us. In Vedic science, this field of pure consciousness is called Atma, the self of us all. At that level, as Dr. John Hagelin would tell you, at that level of life, we are all one. We're one. Diversity up here, unity down below.
I wanted to just sort of round off our conversation because we're getting to the end, Robert. So how does a philosopher spend their day in 2023?
Well, obviously, I mean, in the white heat of cerebral interrogation, without a pause, generally speaking.
Well, you just reminded me because we used to do events down at Westminster Library, just around the corner on the square, and it was actually the site of Isaac Newton's house. And I loved this story about that in that very house. His housekeeper said sometimes he would wake up in the morning and he'd get to the end of his bed and just sit there because he was thinking about something, and she'd find him. He was there for about 3 hours.
Right.
I think we've all had that experience when we've been slightly hungover. But what is your day like? Do you have a sort of philosophical practice, or is it just life?
It's mainly just life. I mean, I work a lot, trying to write books and so on. But, I do other normal stuff as well. I'm a big football fan, for example. I was at the football.
Philosophy of football, we should get onto that sometime.
Yeah, well, I mean, Derrida was a big football fan.
Right.
Camus was a big football fan.
Yeah. Right, excellent. So my final question for you, of course, is who is Robert Rowland Smith.
Exactly. Robert Rowland Smith is the person who has recorded this podcast with you, Stephen, and we'll let the listeners infer from that, whoever I am.
Thanks very much for coming to the Brew of Lost Culture.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to Robert for expanding my mind and consciousness. How was it for you? Are you a seeker or an expander? Perhaps both. I'll put links to Robert and his work in the show notes, and perhaps I'll report back on how I get on in his Constellations group. We've had some great suggestions from listeners of late, some of our usual countercultural comrades, and some new ones. Lauren in Arizona wants to hear more women's voices and queer stories. I agree. So keep the suggestions coming. Now, shall we finish with a tune after all that thinking and talking? I've just made an album, Junk Shop Melodies. Here is one of the tracks from it. It's called The Ghost of a Flea. Till next time.